Now that we've finished the first set of notes for meteorology, where we looked at all of the small details and parts that come together to create weather, we're now going to actually be able to look at how that weather is made and the severe weather that it can cause. So this is still the same unit. We're just going to look at the severe weather part. Before we can do that, you need to know about fronts and air masses, and that's what this section of notes will be about. So an air mass is a large body of air that has similar temperatures and moisture content. So the fact that it has a similar temperature and moisture is a very big deal. So make sure you know that, put a big star next to it. An air mass is characterized by similar temperature and moisture content. Very, very, very important to know. The other important thing to know about an air mass is it keeps the same temperature and moisture conditions as the surface it formed over. That's the key part. So if you are a cold, dry air mass, you form over the middle of Canada, then because you formed over the middle of Canada, that's the conditions you have. Because Canada is cold and Canada is dry, you are a cold, dry air mass. As that air mass begins to move, it's going to start to make other places it moves past more cold and more dry. That's the type of weather it would bring with it. And notice, as I say a cold, dry air mass, I am talking about its temperature, and I'm talking about its moisture content. So that's both of these bullets combined. One thing I always have to do when we get to this part of the notes is to get everybody to embrace the word moist, okay? So everybody say moist. I know that is a word that probably most of you don't like, but embrace it, because we are going to talk about warm, moist air masses and cold, moist air masses. And yes, I do have to keep saying it. So let's just go ahead and embrace the word moist. Nothing wrong with it. It just means moisture. Another word that you can use for moist is humid. So we will be using those two words interchangeably between air masses as we talk about them more and more and more. And maybe those of you who are weirded out by that word, by the end of this unit, hopefully you no longer will have some bias against the word moist. Okay, hopefully you are almost done writing this. One thing that we will see as we look at air masses is you'll get a little bit of clarification at why North Carolina has such weird weather. And that's always good because, North Carolina's weather is a little bit bipolar. And we can find out why from these set of notes. So moving right along. Air mass moves, the characteristics change, and so does the area it moves over. This is what I was telling you about earlier. If you are a cold, dry air mass from Canada, and it starts to move down towards the U.S., then the places that it's moving over are going to become colder and drier. Now, as that air mass continues to move, it's going to eventually start to, I guess you'd say, not become as strong, and therefore it's going to start to warm up the further south it moves, and it's going to start to pick up a little bit more moisture. So as it moves, eventually its characteristics will change. But the main thing to make sure you take note of here is that as it moves, it changes where it goes as well, at least for the first, part of its movement. So if it's a warm, moist air mass coming from the Gulf of Mexico and it moves up towards us, then we're going to have warmer, rainy weather because it's going to bring us warmth and it's going to bring us moisture. Or it could just be a really hot, humid day, depending on how that air mass moved. As you are writing this, you can take a look at the picture to the right of this globe, and you'll see, or hopefully you can tell, that up here where it's purple and blue, that's by the poles, and so those air masses are going to be colder because the poles are cold. And the ones that are down by the South Pole, which you can't see, those are going to be cold because the poles are cold, and they get indirect light. Your warm air masses are mainly going to form right here around the equator, and then your moderate air masses are right around where we are. So those are kind of the three zones, but that's what determines their temperature, is the zone of the earth that it formed over. Okay, so next slide. You already wrote this down, but they're classified by their temperature and the moisture. Another way to say that is we name air masses based on their temperature and moisture. So here's the little chart, and if you want to write down the whole chart, you are welcome to do that. But you also can probably, there's probably some information you can omit. Like if you know polar means it's near the poles, don't write that down, okay? If you know that tropical means near the equator, don't write that down. If in your head it makes sense that continent means over land and that maritime means water or moist, don't write that down. Now, a lot of you probably, the maritime is something you need to write down because that's probably not something most of you know. But write down the information you really need to write. So we have 4 letters or initials that we use when we name an air mass. P for polar, T for tropical, C for continental, and M for maritime. So if you have an air mass and it's cold, and you know it's cold because it formed near the poles, then you would write down the letter P. If it was an air mass that was warm, you know it's warm because it formed by the equator, then you would give that the letter T to stand for tropical. If the air mass was dry, and you know it's dry because it formed over land, you would give the letter C for continental because it formed over a continent. Or if it formed over the ocean, you would know that means that it's moist, and then you would give it an M for maritime. Okay, an M for maritime. Maritime, you can think of marine, if that helps you remember it a little bit more. So I'm going to move on, but if you need to pause this so y'all can finish writing down the chart, then that is perfectly fine. So I'll give you a second just in case that is something that you need to do. Okay, so these are the 4 basic types of air masses, and all that happened here was the letters became combined. So I told you earlier that we name air masses based on their temperature and their moisture content. So that means that you are going to take, and I'll come right back, but you're going to take 2 of the moisture letters, or you're going to take 1 of them. So you pick 1 temperature letter and you combine that with 1 moisture letter. So if it is a warm air mass, I'm going to give it a T. And if it's warm, then I already know the temperature, so now I just need to know the moisture content. Is it a warm dry or a warm moist? If it's a warm dry, then I would give it a C. So it'd be a CT air mass. So all that we're doing on the next slide is combining 1 temperature letter with 1 moisture letter. So I just wanted to point that out. So these are the 4 possible combinations. So your CP air mass, and notice the moisture letter always comes first and the temperature letter always comes second and is capital. I don't know why they set it up that way, but that's just how it is. So a continental polar air mass is a dry, cold air mass. So dry because continental, P, pole for cold. So whenever you look at these, you're just going to identify, is it a hot or a cold one, and then is it wet or dry? And you pick the corresponding letter. So I will give you a moment if you need to, if you want to write down the whole chart, you can, or if you wrote down everything from the last slide, then all you really need to do is the combinations of initials. But if you want to pause the video so that students have time to finish writing, then that is perfectly fine. If not, then I am going to continue moving forward. And this is finally the answer for why North Carolina has such bipolar weather. Don't write this down, but North Carolina is influenced by a continental polar air mass. So we have an air mass up in Canada, and Canada is a dry, so we give it continental because it's land, and it's closer to the poles, so that's why it's P for polar. So we have a CP air mass right above us. But we also, and I'll write that down, so we have a CP air mass up here, and then down here by the Gulf of Mexico, we have a moist air mass, so it's going to be M for maritime, and it's warm because it's closer to the equator, so a T. So we have an MT air mass and a CP air mass. Sometimes the cold, dry air mass likes to come this way, and sometimes the warm, wet one likes to come this way. And so we have these two complete opposite air masses that battle over this section of eastern North Carolina. And because of that, we can get some just completely opposite weather because it all depends on which air mass won the battle. So next time that you wake up and it's 40 degrees and then it's a high of 80 degrees the next day, you can thank our air masses for that occurring. Okay, now I'm going to write some air masses up here, and I want you, they're already written up here, but I'm going to make it easier for you to see. And as I do this, by yourself, without talking, on just anywhere on your paper, I want you to label what they are to make sure that we all understand how to name them. So here is the first one. Here's the second one, third one, and fourth one. So again, by yourself, without talking, I want you to label these air masses, and you're just using the initials. So the C's, P's, T's, and M's. So I'll let you pause this video while you do that. And one thing, hopefully you were able to understand it. One, you know that it's polar because it's close to Canada, and Canada up here is very cold. 4 is very close to the poles, is over land, so that's why it's going to be the CP, C for continental, P for polar. 2 is closer to the equator than it is to the poles down here. It's kind of on the edge, so that one can be tricky for students, but one thing you can always do is count the latitude lines if you're ever unsure to see which one it's closest to. But that is C for, because it's over the continent, T for tropical because it is closer to the equator. 3 is definitely closer to the poles and it's over the water, which is why it's the MP. And I believe that was all of them. So one thing I wanted to make sure I point out, because you will see this on test, I don't know why, but I do know why, but they like to draw air masses, and they will have the number 1 and then an arrow, and they'll have 2 and then an arrow, and they'll have 4, arrow, 3, arrow. If you see this, or let me say, when you see something like this on a test, ignore the arrow, okay? Ignore the arrow. And maybe you need to jot that down, but you ignore the arrow. The arrow is telling you where the air mass will move to. When we are naming air masses, we don't care where the air mass is going to move to, because the air mass is named based on where it formed. So these arrows are not telling you number 1 is located here. It's saying number 1 formed where the number is and will soon move in this direction. But again, when you name air masses, they're named based on the conditions it formed over, so it doesn't matter where it's going to move to. So whenever you see the arrows and it comes to naming them, you always ignore the arrows and name it based on where that air mass formed. So I wanted to point that out because I don't know if I've ever seen a diagram that didn't have the arrows on it. So I wanted to make sure you were aware of that. Okay, now I'm going to flip through some questions, and I'm going to time it. So you do not need to pause the video. I will read the question, and I'll give you a moment to answer it. You're going to answer this by yourself, just on a little separate sheet of paper, or if you have a little section in your notebook that you don't care using, just a scrap sheet of paper. So I'll read the question, I'll pause for a minute to let you answer it, and then I'm going to move on. I will tell you when you only have a couple seconds left, so that way if you haven't made the answer yet, just guess and move on. And whoever gets the most right does get candy, as always, because I got to keep bribing y'all. So let's go ahead and start. So somewhere on a scrap sheet of paper or in your notebook, you're just going to answer them. I think it's 5 or 6 questions, and they're all A, B, C, or D questions. Okay, number 1. An air mass originating over north central Canada would most likely be A, warm and moist, B, cold and moist, C, warm and dry, or D, cold and dry. Okay, moving on in 3, 2, 1. Number 2, an air mass or an empty air mass would most likely originate over which type of Earth surface? Warm and moist, cold and moist, cold and dry, or warm and dry? Moving on in 3, 2, 1. Next. Number 3. An air mass originating over the North Pacific Ocean would most likely be A. Maritime tropical, B. Maritime polar, C. Continental tropical, or D. Continental polar. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Next. What is the name for a male bee that comes from an unfertilized egg? What is the name for a male bee that comes from an unfertilized egg? Just wanted to give an easy one to you. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Number 5. The characteristics of an air mass which formed over the Gulf of Mexico would probably be A. Warm and humid, B. Cool and humid, C. Warm and dry, or D. Cool and dry. And moving on in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Number 6. The properties of an air mass depend mainly on the A. Size of the air mass, B. Wind speed within the air mass, C. Characteristics of the surface it formed over, or D. The rotation of the Earth. And choose your answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning, and in just a second, I'll just go ahead and give you the answers. So check your paper. Number 1 is D as in donut. 2 was A as in antelope. 3 was B as in Beyonce. Number 4 was D as in dragon. Number 5 was A as in acorn. And number 6 is C as in Collins. C as in Collins. So here are your answers. Number 1, D, then A, B, D, A, and C. So I will let y'all pause the video so you can figure out who got the most right. So let's go over these and make sure we all understand them. So an air mass originating over north central Canada. We know north is going to be colder, so you would give that the initial P for polar. And Canada is land, so that's going to be dry, so that would be a C. So it's a CP air mass. And we know that a CP air mass is a cold, dry air mass, which is why number 1 was D. Let's look at number 2. An empty air mass would most likely originate over which type of surface? Well, we know M stands for moist or humid, and we know that T means warm, So it is a warm and moist air mass, which is why the answer was A. Number 3, an air mass originated over the North Pacific Ocean. So this is telling you that it's in the north. We know the north to be cold, so that would be a P. And we know the ocean is a body of water, so it's going to be a moist. So you know that this is a maritime polar air mass, which is why the answer was B. Number 4, this is just basic information. Just kidding. I thought I'd throw in a random trivia question that I'd never heard of, just to make sure there's a little bit of a tiebreaker. So the name for a male bee that comes from an unfertilized egg is a drone. No idea why, no idea how that can happen. You can Google that in your own time, but just thought I would throw in a fun little fact for you there. Number 5, the characteristics of an air mass over the Gulf of Mexico would be, well, we know Mexico is near the equator, so it's warm, and warm areas get a T for tropical. And the Gulf of Mexico, if you don't know this, make sure you do, because we're going to talk about the Gulf a lot. The Gulf of Mexico is a body of water. So because this is water, it's going to be a moist or a humid one. So I have an MT air mass, which is a warm, humid air mass, which is why number 5 was A. And our last one, number 6, the properties of an air mass depend on the surface that it formed over. The surface it formed over, that's why when you look at a map, you always look at the number, and you do not look at the arrows, you look at the number, because that's how we name it, and hopefully I've drilled that into your head. So those are your trivia questions. Make sure whenever you're done with the candy for whoever won, that you do throw the wrappers away. So let's just keep on going. Okay, we are now going to talk about if two air masses collide. So what do you think would happen if two air masses collide? I'm going to let y'all pause this video so you can talk about it.